Hello, everyone. I've got the great pleasure tonight to be here online with Bishop Barron, a Catholic bishop, a man that I admire for his not only his gifts as a communicator, but his ability to speak to the heart of questions that are right at the foundation of human life. Thank you so much for joining me tonight, Bishop.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me on. Look forward to the conversation.
Well, let's get right into it, and I think that we can go straight into let's skip the first steps and go right to the right to the seventh, and that is, we're living in a time in which there's a widespread belief that Athens and Jerusalem, to use a shorthand, are completely opposed. Yeah. That either you can have rationality and empirical science and really kind of things you can really know, or you can have the whole world of religion and myth and ritual, but that those are fundamentally incommensurable. I'd like to hear what you think about that generally, and then perhaps we can take a few minutes and go right into some of the what are the most, let's call them, foundational views or beliefs or truths, as the Christian religion understands it, of the Christian religion. And I'd love to hear you speak about how you understand those in rational or universal terms. And we can touch on any number of other things. We're going to let this go wherever it goes. But let's start off with, do you accept that fundamentally you have to choose between reason and revelation?
No, I don't accept that. And in some ways, my whole career has been predicated upon the rejection of that view, which, used Athens, Jerusalem, going back to Tertullian, who made that famous demarcation. What has Athens to do with Jerusalem? Very much in his mind in favor of Jerusalem. If you've got the faith, you've got divine revelation, why would you mess around with these, questionable philosophers? And I'm delighted to say the mainstream of the Catholic tradition has always stood athwart that position. You see a certain revival of it, I must say, with the reformers, very bright men, Luther, Calvin, but you find some of that same quality of disdain for the philosophical tradition. The Catholic tradition at its best has not walked that Tertullian route, and that we've seen a deep congruence between faith and reason, based simply upon the insight that God is the source of all being and all truth, and therefore whatever the sciences discover is from God, is a reflection of the divine mind. So in that way, revelation and reason can never be out of sync with each other. They represent different modes of knowing, different degrees of knowledge, if I can use that term from Jacques Maritain. And in some ways, Tertullian is at the root of this problem, but also our current version of it is very much of a modernism, born of a religious fundamentalism that I would trace back to the maybe late 19th, early 20th centuries, that has been a terrible source of mischief, in my judgment. And it's led to this driving of a wedge between faith and reason. So I hope, gosh, if I can make one contribution as a sort of public intellectual, as someone that tries to articulate the faith in a public way, it would be to revive the congruence of faith and reason tradition. So that's the source of a lot of mischief, that division.
I certainly agree with you. I had the pleasure of giving a lecture at the University of Cambridge in the Faculty of Divinity a couple of weeks ago, and this was very much at the heart of what I was approaching in that lecture. Yeah. I'd love to ask you how you see the influence of, relative to this question, how you see the influence of the ancient Greeks, of the Greek philosophical, or the Greek, let's say, broadly speaking, intellectual tradition, which of course is very fundamental to the working out of to the interpretation by the early Christians of what they thought their religion was about. Could you say a few words about that? Because I think one thing that's very clear is that the someone like Augustine, for example, would never have accepted this division between Athens and Jerusalem. Nor would the ancient Indians have accepted an opposition between religion and reason.
Yeah, and I go back to Joseph Ratzinger, Benedict XVI, but when he wrote his great Introduction to Christianity, he said the early Christians made an option for logos over mythos, and that everything flowed from that. And what he meant was, in trying to articulate the faith, the early fathers tended not to go with the mythological tradition. They went with the philosophical tradition because they saw a greater congruence between a logos revelation tradition and the logos tradition behind Greek philosophy. And so think of the option of all those early figures, both East and West among the fathers. Whenever they embraced a logos theology, they tended to embrace at the same time a logos philosophy. And that's where this great congruence of faith and reason ultimately comes from. Without that move, that choice of logos over mythos, you don't have Thomas Aquinas. You don't have this great scholastic tradition. In some ways, I think Ratzinger put his finger on a source of mischief. If we opt for mythos over logos, then we end up in this totally bifurcated space. And religion deals with something which really isn't true. It might be uplifting, might be edifying, might be interesting, might be engaging your imagination as the myths do, but it wouldn't be true the way philosophy claims to be true. But it was a fateful, and in a very positive way, a fateful decision that the early fathers made for logos over mythos.
Now, relative to that and relative to the way you characterized our contemporary situation, excuse me, dating back to, let's say, post-Enlightenment notions of truth and things of that sort. One of the things that I see to be at stake here is whether immaterial things can be known or not. And so one of the let's call it pretensions or assumptions of a certain kind of reductive scientism, or however we might call it, is that the only thing that can be known is matter and its motion.
Mm-hmm.
But the very knowing that knows that matter and its motion, the very principles of, say, mathematics, for example, upon which science relies, that reductive empirical account can give no account of why those things.
Yeah.
It can give no account of its own thinking, no account of the realities upon which it depends. So what I'd like to ask you is, say a thing or two about that, if you like, but connect that to the conception of the logos, because what is the logos for the logos, however one might pronounce that, for the ancients as it is taken up by the Christian tradition.
Yeah, and your point is very well taken. Scientism, which is rampant today. I mean, I see it both in the high culture, but also in my popular work dealing with people and at the apologetic level. It's rampant among young people. Precisely as you put it, the assumption that the only legitimate form of knowledge is that which is derivable from the scientific method. But the problem, as you suggest correctly, is it's perfectly self-refuting, because the one thing you can't verify empirically and do experiments on is the claim that only that kind of truth is valid. And so just by its very nature, it's self-refuting. And see, what's happened, in my judgment, is scientism locks us back into Plato's cave. So go right back to the beginning of philosophy in the West. Plato's absolutely seminal move to describe the journey from the cave to the realm outside the cave means you escape merely the realm of the empirically verifiable. So the people who are chained inside the cave in Plato's famous image, right, who see the flickering images on the wall, well, that's all of us dealing with this world of immediate sense experience, which is good and real, no question about that, but it's real in a very passing, contingent, evanescent way. What Plato was doing was leading his adepts by a series of exercises, I would say physical, spiritual, and psychological exercises to get out of the cave and to move into a higher form of consciousness, whereby you come in contact with dimensions of reality which are not observable and which can't be experimented on. And see, that's classical pre-modern thought, took that for granted. What happened, I think, tragically with the rise of the physical sciences, though I wouldn't blame it on the sciences in themselves, but these philosophical moves that precluded, effectively, any escape from the cave. Now, read someone like Charles Taylor today, and the idea of the buffered self, right, which is his description of the way most people are today, buffered from any contact with the transcendent. I would say those are people stuck in the cave. And one reason they're stuck in the cave is this ideological scientism, which has precluded the mind's quest for higher dimensions of reality. So you talk about material, spiritual, if you want, but I might talk of more and more intense expressions of being. So for Plato, going from the sensible world to the world of mathematical objects to the world of the forms represents this journey into ever more intense expressions of being. Again, the greatest minds in the pre-modern world took that for granted, took that ascent of the mind for granted. That's what's missing for an awful lot of people today. And it's doing not just intellectual damage, it's doing real spiritual damage to people because we're not meant finally just for the cave. So that's my somewhat more elaborated answer to your first observation. Logos, speculation. I would say logos, go back to Heraclitus and people like that. Logos represents the fundamental intelligibility of the real, which is one of the most important intuitions of classical thought. That being, as the medieval said, ens as scibile, right? Being is knowable. Being has an intelligible form. Now, that can be something as simple as a rock, a basic sensible thing, has an intelligible structure. But then you move up by steady progress to higher and higher modalities of intelligibility. And what runs through all of it is precisely logos. It's some kind of divine reason, so seen as reflective of God's intelligent purposes. I mean, that vision of the world that I would hold to as a Catholic thinker, but I'd say also as a classical thinker, a lot of that is missing from let's face it, marvelous sciences. We all reverence the sciences and what they've accomplished, but a scientism has blocked our access to these far deeper and richer expressions of the real.
I think what's so powerful and important what you're saying, among other things, is that this is not a move away from knowing. So, one might associate rightly, I think, in many respects, science with a disciplined and rigorous and self-critical approach. Those are the
I just lost contact with you.
There we are. Are you back? I lost you.
There we go. Go ahead. I'm back. Yeah, keep going.
Great. One might culturally associate, the lab coat or the discipline, the criticism, the objectivity of the sciences. I think, rightly with at least when they're working well, with all those characteristics. Yeah. What I take you to be saying, which I think is so important, is that we're not leaving those things behind. Self-criticism, careful, shrewd, hard-going analysis as one moves up, let's say in the Platonic language. You mentioned the cave, as you well know. One of his other famous allegories or metaphors is of the line, where you have on the one side kinds of being, and the other side forms of intelligibility or apprehension adequate to those forms of being. And you move up roughly, as you said, from sense to imagination to math or rationality, and then to a higher form of let's say non-linear or not precisely discursive, but more intuitive knowing in what was later called, as you know, intelligentsia. So what I'd like to get a sense of is, and have you say another word or two about is relative to a sort of logos conception of things that we might see both in Greek philosophy and in, let's say, the first words of the Gospel of John, all things being made in and through and by the Word. That is to say, all things being fundamentally intelligible. What I'd like to ask you about is what is the form of what are the kinds of things that we are knowing about? So let's say that if we take very simply matter and its motion as the remit of the sciences at some level, if that's all we can know, then we have no access to thinking carefully and shrewdly and powerfully about, say, love or redemption or beauty or truth itself or even thinking itself. So and you've pointed out the consequent reductions of our own souls or selves if we've cut off that whole horizon of thinking. So I'd like to ask you to turn to say a few words about what we are as human beings by nature, and what are the, let's say, higher forms of knowing and perception that we can come to through through that, as you say, that sort of ladder of thinking, that intellectual ascent.
Yeah, and we've both been talking about Plato and then implicitly about Aristotle and the different degrees of knowing, from the like physics to mathematics to metaphysics. I would add then, as you're suggesting, beyond that, the mystical way of knowing, somewhat corresponding to Plato's, knowledge of what lies beyond the beings, right? The form of the good. But everything you laid out is right, that all the classical subject matters of philosophy are missing from a scientistic or purely materialistic worldview. So I've often sort of cajoled people that are stuck in that complete ideological scientism. Tell me how the sciences inform us in regard to the question of what makes something beautiful. When we say, well, that's a beautiful work of art, and you can analyze, the chemical makeup of a painting, or you can look at, the process, the physiological process of seeing and all that business. But that's not going to answer the question, what makes that picture beautiful? What makes a city just? What's the very nature of knowledge, as you say correctly? What's the nature of the soul? Finally, what's the source of all existence? I mean, those are all questions that the mind entertains. Don't tell me those are uninteresting questions, because the mind naturally entertains them, but it can't get at them using simply a scientific method. That's why I feel strongly about this. Very often we pitch the thing as like science versus religion. What we need to recover are all those mediating disciplines associated with philosophy, because philosophy is a way of knowing. It's a rational path, but not a scientific path. Because for a lot of people, I think, especially young people today, to be rational and to be a physical scientist are coterminous. Right? That's what it means to be rational, is to do things in a scientific way. Yeah. And I want to say, no, look at our tradition that shows all kinds of forms of rationality that are not scientific forms of rationality. It's the, Cardinal Newman saw this in the 19th century. It's the aggressiveness of the sciences that is the problem. It's not the sciences in themselves, but a sort of epistemological aggressiveness that has worked a lot of mischief today in the minds, especially of young people. So I would say the recovery of the philosophical tradition is very important if we want to get to the further question of science in relation to religion.
Yes, I think that's completely right, and I would perhaps table for another conversation, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on what are the intellectual influences that have led to a worldview widely held right now that we cannot know things that are immaterial. I trace it back to figures like Marx and others in the early mid 19th century, and the denial that there is any realm of the immaterial or the transcendent. There's no reality to those things. They're all just projections of our imagination. Religion makes man. Man makes religion. Religion does not make man, as Marx puts it himself. Say a word or two before we go back to some other questions here. Say a word or two about the damage. As a at one time a priest and now a bishop, you are very, I imagine, very often in pastoral relationships with people who come to you with the hardest and most difficult and perennial and most universal problems in human life, whether it's love or health or suffering, depression. I know enough priests to know that you see it all. I'd love to know. Let's put it positively. Not just what are the limitations of this worldview, but let's put it positively. What is the hunger that you see in the soul, or let's just say in the human being at the most profound level? What do we seek as human beings? What is the nature of what we are looking for?
We're seeking a higher love. So the soul is ordered to love, and so it goes out from itself and it loves whatever it comes across. I mean, the scientists are born of a love for knowledge, a love for the truth and goodness and beauty of the world. But the soul keeps going. It's not satisfied with that. It wants higher forms of love because it corresponds to higher types of being. And finally, I would argue with St. Augustine here that the soul is restless until it rests in God. So what we're finally hungry for is absolute truth and absolute beauty and absolute goodness. And any attempt to limit that results in a great deal of frustration and soul sickness. And I would speak now, one of the old terms for a priest, in French, we talk about a curé, like the curé d'Ars, the curé of Ars. And in the old days, we spoke about a curate. So usually the associate pastor is called the curate. Well, those terms come from cura, right? Care. Because what the priest did was cura animarum, the care of souls. And I've always liked that phrase. That's the priest's job. So we have, physicians to deal with the health of the body. We have psychiatrists and so on to deal with the health of the psyche. But who cares for the soul? And that's classically the role of the curate, the curé, the priest, who addresses the issues of the soul. What's the soul hungry for? What goes wrong with the soul? How to fix it? And think of this. I mean, prior to the turn to the sciences, most of the great minds in the West went in for soul doctoring. So I would read the great texts of theology and spirituality under that rubric. They're texts of cura animarum. But when you bracket the question of soul, you forget about soul. You don't even think it exists. Well, I tell you, the soul asserts itself in suffering. And that's where we come in often to do cura animarum, care for the soul. And that's where religion comes in. And that's been true. I'm not just talking about Catholicism, but that goes back to the beginning of humanity, that we've had a religious instinct. I think it's a very troubling sign of our time that arguably for the first time in human history, certainly in the West, we now have a very significant part of the population that brackets religion. Religion is unimportant. We're unaffiliated. We just don't care about it. Well, trust me, the soul still cares about it. And it'll cry out in anguish if it gets frustrated.
You spoke about the soul wanting to be filled by, or let's say, satisfied in relation to, fulfilled by, not simply momentary things, but absolute things, absolute truth, absolute beauty. What in the world does that mean? That when what I want to hear is to put in a universal form, in a language that doesn't, as you indeed are, that doesn't involve recourse to particular Christian doctrines or views or let's say creedal statements. What is the nature of the higher fulfillment? Augustine speaks about the human being being an imago Dei, an image of God. What does that mean? Such that really the question I want to get to here, Bishop, is what is human fulfillment as an activity in this life? What does it look like? A not simply well-adjusted, but deeply satisfied, fully, let's say, activated, turned on, actualized human being. What are we aiming for when you speak in this language of absolute love and absolute truth?
Yeah. Maybe I'd start with Saint Irenaeus, one of my heroes, who said, Gloria Dei homo vivens, right? The glory of God is a human being fully alive. So I would say when we're fully alive, meaning all of our powers and capacities are awakened and ordered to what ultimately fulfills them, that's what gives God the glory, because we're wired for God. I would say it's the quest for the unconditioned. I'm trying to stay away from more explicitly religious language. I'll use more Kantian language, but that was picked up by many of the theologians in the 20th century. Das Unbedingte, the unconditioned. is what is finally calling out to the mind as it knows particular things. And go back to Plato's cave. It's knowing the particular sensible objects. Then it escapes from the cave and it knows mathematical objects, and then it knows the forms. But then what's it looking for ultimately? It looks up toward the sun, right? Which, mind you, it can't see directly. You can't look, it can't stare at the sun. It's the light by which you see everything else. But yet the mind wants that. The mind is ordered to it, the form of the good, which is beyond being. Well, that's das Unbedingte. That's the unconditioned. As the will, for example, seeks the good, and it seeks it here and there. It seeks justice and seeks higher forms of justice. But what it finally wants is unconditioned justice. It wants the good in itself. The same with the beautiful. I seek beautiful things. I want to create beautiful things. I want to celebrate and propagate beautiful things. I go to higher and higher forms of beauty. Think of the way you educate a kid to move from, maybe some simple thing he finds beautiful to higher and higher forms of it. But what the soul wants is the beautiful itself, unconditioned beauty. Now, keep Plato in mind. None of those unconditioned forms can be seen directly in this life. In this life, I'm ordered to particular forms of the good, the true, and the beautiful. The unconditioned is something that attracts me and blinds me at the same time. Now, I'm a Catholic bishop. I'm talking ultimately here about God. God is what's luring and drawing all of my faculties and powers, all the elements that make up my soul. It's driving my mind. See, which is why you'd never play the game of, let's put your mind to sleep. Faith is opposed to reason. That is just nonsense. It's reason now fully awakened and aware of its proper limits within this framework of experience. It's the will fully awakened, but now aware of its proper limits within this framework, but yearning beyond whatever it can know or will in this life. That, I think, is a properly spiritual framework for a happy life. So I'd say to the scientists, the artists, the poets, the politicians, the seekers after justice, go, off you go, do all that you can, but then also unleash your soul's desire for the unconditioned form of those three great values. That's, I think, what a properly textured spiritual life looks like.
That's beautifully put, Bishop. One of my favorite lines from all the films I've ever seen is a line by the great sprinter Eric Liddell in Chariots of Fire. I think he's writing to his sister, and he says, I know God made me for a purpose, but he also made me fast. And when I run, I feel his good pleasure. That's a kind of a paraphrase.
I feel the pleasure of God.
I've always found that in that there's a kind of evocation of what we all know it feels like when you're giving yourself over to the higher and deeper things from which meaning fundamentally is derived. One of the things about the sort of called meaning crisis in the moment is that no matter how existentialist people might want to be or think of themselves, if the self was capable simply of generating meaning on its own, it would never lack for it. It would just endlessly have all required. But I want to push you on something and really get to what sort of I see to be the nub of the matter here, because you talk about the unconditioned and our longing, our restlessness for what is richer, higher, truer, deeper, absolute. And I think that language speaks to people because I think it's in us to be fulfilled by the perception, the coming to know things that are actually transcendent here, but in the here and now. But how they are in the here and now is what I want to push you on here. I want to ask you, listen, we all know those great moments in life when, you fall in love, or it's a beautiful evening with friends and nice glasses of wine, or you're on the beach in an astoundingly beautiful day, or you're sheltering from a great rainstorm, or you've been touched by forgiveness in your life, or something like by a friend.
Yeah.
Those moments where you think, this is what it's all about. I'm really living. I want to, it's easy to believe in those moments that there's a coherence between the infinite and the finite, between the immaterial and the material, the divine and the human, let's say. But man, so much of life, we're struggling. People get sick and die. We let ourselves and others down in painful and sometimes terrible ways. We have to deal with the difficulties of sometimes demeaning work, or difficult work, or our own psychological struggles. What seems to me at the heart of the Christian religion is the claim that the divine and the human come together. That at the lowest, darkest moment is not simply a lost, unreconcilable, a lost, unreconcilable thing that can never, that you might say, Aristotle's conclusion, to put it one way, is, alas, he says in the 10th book of the Metaphysics, that life that I've just been sketching out, that would be a life too high for man. We can't live that life of contemplation. We're always going to fall short of that. How do you understand precisely our distance from those things, and is that distance redeemed?
Yeah, I mean, you said so many things there, all of them good and right, and each one would deserve a semester course, to address. Let me begin maybe with C.S. Lewis, who said, God's existence is felt, or no, let me put it this way: the longing for God is felt more in the great and pleasant moments of life than in the suffering moments of life. And what he meant, I think, was what you were just describing, these wonderful moments of great pleasure, of great honor, of great achievement, right? But what inevitably happens is, even as we bask in the joy of those moments, deep down we know it's not enough. They pass away. So, right, you're on the beach and there's this gorgeous sunset going on and it's unsurpassably beautiful. But then in a matter of minutes, hour or so, it is gone, and it's gone forever. That lovely dinner with friends and everything's clicking and the conversation is great and you're feeling this deep connection, and then it's over. It's precisely at those moments, the best moments, that you feel that aching longing for something more. Now, certainly in the negative moments too, when you realize how limited life is and how unsatisfying it is, that too awakens the soul for something more. And of course, in itself, that's interesting, isn't it? Why do we perceive certain things as bad? Because in comparison to something else, something we know that it should be otherwise, it should not be like this. That comparison is born of a very deep perception of the ultimate purpose of things. So I would say both the negative and the positive speak finally to the longing for something more. You were hinting then finally at something very profound, is we have to move outside of philosophy for this. But the Christian claim that in Jesus, das Unbedingte, right, the unconditioned, comes so deeply into our conditioned state of affairs, seizing all of it. And that's the symbol of the cross, of das Unbedingte, the unconditioned reality, going all the way into God-forsakenness, going to the limit of human degradation and loss and alienation from God, and thereby redeeming all of it, showing the ultimate purpose of all of it. Jesus, in his open table fellowship with saints and sinners, think of the festive Christ, Jesus healing the sick, Jesus reaching out to the poor, all those kind of wonderful positive. And then Jesus entering into the fullness of alienation, suffering, pain on the cross, is das Unbedingte, the unconditioned God, embracing the totality of our humanity. So that's the ultimate Christian answer to this. How would I put it? Not this dilemma, but this tension that's ingredient in human life. But both the negative and the positive signal the longing for God. No question about it.
So you're speaking there beautifully about the Christian idea of the incarnation, that God himself became man in the form of Jesus Christ, lived on earth, died, was crucified, and resurrected and ascended to heaven. In a nutshell, that's the story. I take it that what is going on there is the claim that even that if God is not present to us in the distance from God, if the infinite is not present in the finite, if our very failings cannot themselves become doorways or points of access to the yonder, then it all falls apart after all. We live 99% of our lives in that sense of distance, let's say. So if the Christian view is that indeed all things are taken up wholly and absolutely, with no exceptions whatsoever, into the divine activity, let's say, which we maybe come to in a minute, we can touch on the Trinity. The question I have is this: if Christians believe that was revealed at some point, and then through the scriptures and through Jesus' life on earth and the later the apostles and all of that, and they believe that truth is revealed, well, must it not have, though perhaps it was not understood in that form, must that truth, if it is indeed true, already have been true in earlier times and points in history? And must it not still be true for all people at all times everywhere, even if they do not themselves understand it in the language of Christ, or even perhaps believe in Christ? So what I'm trying to press here is, how do we come to encounter, if that is a universal and sovereign principle, God, or the Unbedingte, as you call it, the transcendent absolute, here in our broken finitude?
Nope, I think I lost you again.
Oh, can you hear me?
Oh, there we go. Now I got you.
Where did I?
Go ahead.
Okay. Okay, I'm not sure when I lost you, but my question is essentially, if what
Our
Christians
broken
believe
finitude.
True, yeah. How do we encounter day to day the infinite or the transcendent in the very midst of our, let's say, our crosses, our disappointments, our sicknesses?
Yeah, I mean, again, you're raising a lot of interesting issues. I mean, first of all, I wouldn't agree with the claim that, let's say, because it's already universally the case that God is a God of love who invites all people to life in his name, that therefore everyone's okay. We don't really need the Christian revelation. Something happened in Jesus. I mean, something happened. God changed the world. God made something possible that wasn't possible before. And there I talk about being grafted onto Christ, to use Paul's language. The church, the community of those gathered around Jesus, the mystical body of Christ. What's on offer to people is to be drawn into that intimacy with God, made possible in Christ. And so I take very seriously proclamation, evangelization, missionary work. I don't think it's true that everyone's already okay. I think there's something truly offered that was new and fresh, hence the good news of the gospel. That's still good news and still has to be proclaimed and heard afresh. Now, when you've heard that, come in, accept it, enter into the dynamics of the mystical body of Jesus, and you'll find this reconciliation and salvation. So I would take that very seriously. We're moving in away from a philosophical frame of reference to a properly theological one. But the necessity of real evangelization, I don't think Jesus, in other words, I'm not saying you were saying this explicitly, but I was catching the overtone of, one archetypal expression among many, that there's all kinds of different archetypal expressions of the absolute coming into contact with the finite. I think there's something distinctive and unique about Jesus, and the historicity of it matters enormously, that it happened. And we're called now to join in the dynamics of that across our own history. So again, now we're moving into the area of evangelism and of what we call ecclesiology, or the participation in the church.
Yes, well, one could pursue this question further insofar as fundamental to any rational religion, whether it's Plato or Augustine, is the view that God himself does not change. And so what is revealed in the incarnation must have been true already of God. And in some sense, Christ, the Lamb of God that was slain before the world began, is some language that one might use to describe this. All things being made in and through the Word, as the Gospel of John puts it. Of course, this is one of the reasons that I take it you take evangelism is so important, and one of the reasons why I think serious encounters with serious things are so important, because a great deal does depend on how we come to understand them. If, as you're saying earlier, if we eliminate the idea that anything transcendent or immaterial can be known, well, our lives are pretty damn impoverished.
Yeah.
Whereas
right.
if we come to accept what it means seriously to think about those things, they become infinitely enriched. So I'm not suggesting that the ways we understand these things is somehow immaterial, or to use the word immaterial in a different sense, or arbitrary, or there's simply a series of archetypes, but rather that, one of the ways this comes out, for example, in Dante and others, Abraham believed and it was credited unto him as righteousness. So even in the Christian account, by what's moved in the Old Testament, there must have been some sense that the mediation that I take it you see to be revealed in Christ is already an active principle, even if it's not understood, if I can put it that way.
Yeah, or I'd say there are rays of truth in all the great religions and the great philosophies. You can find hints and echoes of this fullness. So I never want to move into the stance of, Christianity right, everybody else wrong, or this is the true religion versus false religion. That's too stark. There are all kinds of elements of truth, and Judaism is a prime example. Obviously, Christianity is simply a further, it is born of that parent religion. So we'd find all kinds of points of contact. And it's true in the other great philosophies and religions. Yet there's a fullness on offer in Christianity that is worth taking very seriously. So you're on you're kind of skating on an edge there between a sort of indifferentism or relativism and then a sort of religious absolutism. I would say there's a fullness, a completeness of revelation on display in Christianity, but elements of which are also on offer in other great religions. And that's the basis for ongoing conversation, is to find those points of contact. And we were doing it earlier, talking about philosophy. And all we were doing there was mimicking the church fathers. So here I'm a bishop of the church, as John Chrysostom was, as Augustine was. And they spoke philosophical language of their time. And so we were speaking philosophically. Good. Those are points of contact, important ones. But then my purpose as an evangelist is to lead people to what I would perceive to be the fullness of the divine revelation. But beginning with the points of contact, and, I think those are key moves.
Yes, and certainly, as you were saying earlier, I mean, there's a certain sense in which the Christian claim is profoundly a universal one, insofar as it is making the claim that God himself is truth, and that all things are made in and through that divine intelligibility, as you said earlier. And so from that point of view, any thing that is true is
Yeah.
true because it is sustained by that, you might say, that divine intelligibility or known in that. And
Yep.
so, there's a certain version of Christianity, a certain evangelical version, that would say, well, there's Christian music, and then there's non-Christian music, and it's a kind of Manichaeism. There's a good form of this and a
Yeah.
bad form of this. But certainly
Yeah.
theologically, I'd say Orthodox Christian view is that all things that are good are simply, there's nothing good that is outside of let's say, the divine economy.
Yeah.
But speaking of which, let's move on to, you were talking about this notion of the incarnation, that in and through this life one can come to know that transcendent, that unbedingte, what's the German word? How do you put that? The
Das Unbedingte. The unconditioned, yeah.
Unbedingte. My German is a bit schlecht here at the moment. But let's turn to say, what is the relation between that idea that in time and change one can come to participate in something beyond simply matter and its motion, and what Christians call the Trinity? I mean, that just seems so far out for many people, but I take it that what's moving there is a very deep theological account of what reality itself is.
Yeah, good. And you're coming to the two, in some ways, central and most beguiling mysteries in Christianity. But in a way, everything we've been talking about in this past hour has been about the incarnation. We're talking about the longing of the finite for the infinite. We're talking about the journey from the material to the immaterial. We're talking about a passion for union with the transcendent, with das Unbedingte, with God, that's built into the human being. The incarnation, now, lest it seem like just this strange metaphysical outlier, to see it rather as the fulfillment of this longing which is inchoately present in every one of us. Why was it that when that message of incarnation was announced, people didn't say, well, that's a bunch of nonsense? What led people to say, no, that's right. That strikes me as right, that God would have done that, because God is placed within us already, and it's present in every quest for the true, the good, the beautiful, everything else, the transcendent. It's ingredient in the frustration we feel when the best things in life fade away so quickly. All of that, you might say, is implicitly a longing for the incarnation, which is why when it's announced, we say, yes, that's it. That's what I've wanted all along. I think that makes the incarnation much less anomalous and like a strange metaphysical exception. In some ways, it's a longing that's altogether intelligible. Or I should say, it's a mystery intelligible in light of our deepest longing. Here's a second take on the incarnation. So God became human without ceasing to be God and without compromising the integrity of the human he became. That's a way to state it formulaically, that in Jesus, two natures, we say divine and human, came together without mixing, mingling, or confusion. That's the Council of Chalcedon. So divinity and a creature meet in a personal union, but in such a way that they are not in competition with each other. That signals something extremely important about God, namely that God is not finally competitive with his creation. So you think of any two creaturely things, there's a mutual exclusivity about them. The podium becomes ash only by being burned and destroyed. The one animal becomes the other, but only by being devoured. Right? There's a mutual independence, exclusivity about creatures. But now we say in Jesus, God becomes a creature, but without overwhelming or destroying or compromising the creature he becomes. That means God exists in such a way that he's non-competitive with his creation. This, I would argue, is behind all these distinctive Christian claims that God is not so much a being, but use Thomas's language. God is ipsum esse subsistens. God is the sheer act of to be itself. God is not ens summum in Aquinas, the highest being, because the highest being would be in competition with lower types of being. But God is not like that. God is ipsum esse, who can come infinitely close to his creation without compromising his creation. The great biblical image, by the way, for that is the burning bush. So Moses sees the bush on fire, but not consumed. And from that image, from that thing, comes the voice of God. Well, what's being communicated there is that the closer God gets to the world, the more the world is rendered beautiful, and it's not compromised. It's not burned up. That idea reaches its fulfillment, its full expression in the incarnation. And that in turn is the ground of all Christian humanism, it seems to me. There's nothing of the human that has to be put down or denied in order for God to become close to us. And that now doubles right back to the beginning of our conversation. The glory of God as a human being fully alive. Awaken the mind, awaken the will, awaken every power in you. That's what God wants. So those are a couple ways to unpack, I think, some significance of the incarnation.
May I just quickly follow up on that, Bishop, and ask?
Yeah.
So, would you know, in our popular culture, Catholicism and Christianity generally is associated with a kind of body hating, guilt. Always beating yourself up and renouncing the pleasures of this world. And what is that a misunderstanding? Obviously, I'm suspecting you wouldn't accept that account of things, but I really want to give you a chance to positively refute it, and if that's what you think.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. I begin with Hilaire Belloc, the famous little couplet: "Wherever the Catholic sun does shine, there's music and laughter and good red wine." That's the Catholic sensibility. And it's grounded in the metaphysics that I was just articulating about God's non-competitive transcendence to the world. Where's the character come from? Well, some probably bad Catholic teaching and bad Catholic witnessing to the form of the Christian life. But see, what is Catholic moral theology trying to do? It's trying to bring everything in life under the aegis of love, because love is what God is, right? And we're hungry for God. So everything should be brought under the aegis of love. What's love is to will the good of the other. Now, take that rubric and read the church's teaching on sexuality. Is it a hatred of the body? No, that might be Plato. It's not Catholicism. Is it a hatred of sexuality? No, that might be Manichaeism, or that might be Gnosticism. It's not Catholic Christianity. What it is an attempt to bring human sexuality under the aegis of love. Now, read John Paul II. They're so good on those issues. We want to structure human sexuality in such a way that it's geared not toward the pleasure of the ego, but is geared toward radical self-gift. That's how you understand all of the prohibitions that are built into Catholic teaching around sexuality. But to read it as Puritanism or Manichaeism or Platonism or Gnosticism, that's completely wrong-headed. I'd read it as a philosophy or theology of love or of radical self-gift. And then I would say, furthermore, I'll get a little defensive here, look around our culture and you tell me that rampant sexual libertinism has made everybody happy. I mean, give me a break. When I look around, the Catholic Church hung up on sexuality and that they're so repressed and come off it. Look around our society and you tell me that our past 60 years of complete sexual freedom has just made everybody blissfully happy. I mean, I can go through, we'll need another hour, but I mean, the sheer suffering visited upon the human race by an undisciplined, sort of rampant, self-satisfying sexuality. So I guess you're sensing I get a little defensive around that claim. But to your original point, the puritanical reading has nothing to do with authentic biblical Christianity.
I'm very glad to hear you put it that way. Of course, that's very much my reading, that the taking up of the Greeks in the way that we've been speaking, as the Christians understand that through the incarnation, leads to a profound affirmation of this world, of this life, of the joys of this life. Let me ask you two last questions, Bishop. Bishop, you've just been speaking very beautifully about, you said that we're made for love, and that love, you use the language of, is self-gift or self-giving or even radical self-giving. I'm wondering if you could say a bit more about what love is self-giving, and perhaps touch on what forgiveness is in relation to that.
Yeah, I go back to the classic Thomas Aquinas definition. To love is to will the good of the other. And then I like some contemporary people have added as other, because what we can often do is you can even will the good of the other, but for your own sake, so that indirectly it might redound to your benefit. But to love is to break out of that sort of black hole, where everything gets referenced back to your ego. To love is to say, I truly want your good. And that's an extraordinary move. It's a very rare attainment of the spirit. And we call it in Christianity a theological virtue, because it's of God. It's what God is. Now, forgiveness is a modality of love. Why? Because it's willing the good of the other, not willing my own satisfaction that will come from revenge. So if I've been hurt, there's a kind of satisfaction I get from nursing that grudge, of seeking revenge. That's seeking my own good. But if I say, no, I really want your good, period, for your sake, then of course it'll manifest itself as forgiveness. Jesus on the cross, as he's being crucified, saying to his torturers, Father, forgive them, is the great archetype of that, right? It's in some ways the purest expression of love, because you're willing the good of those who have harmed you. And so there's no good you could possibly indirectly cull from that. It's a purely ecstatic act, if you know what I mean. It takes you out of the realm of self-reference. So that's how I'd relate those two.
That's beautifully said. Would you go so far as to say that the way you put that, to move beyond love is simply a let's call it an alignment of interests or something of that? I'm you scratch my back and I scratch mine. Or let's say a kind of narrow reciprocity. Let's put it that way.
Yeah.
To move beyond that to loving the other as other, and indeed even to forgive them when they have hurt you. Is that, in a sense, is what's happening in that precisely, if I can put it this way in a kind of philosophical language, for the self to participate, for us as individuals to participate in a kind of infinity, because we are not being narrowed or defined by that limit, but giving ourselves over to something that is beyond the limit.
Well, yes, because it's a theological virtue, it can't be something that you habituate yourself toward. So think of the cardinal virtues, in classical philosophy. You can habituate yourself to become more courageous and more just and more prudent and so on. But you can't really practice your way to love, because it's a participation in the way that God is. I'd use the language of grace. It's the reception of a grace, of a sheer gift. It's a way of being that I can't attain to by my efforts, but I can participate in through the acceptance of grace. And to that degree, yes, it's something infinite, because it's of the very nature of God to exist in that way. That's why it's deeply mysterious. Love is a deeply mysterious thing when you actually see it showing up.
It's interesting, because I would have would have understood this perhaps in the way that I think Dante does, which is that the habituation and even there's habituation even in the theological virtues, and so insofar as we can develop a habit of, say, self self self-giving, or a habit of forgiveness, or let's call it a stance in the world. And I understand, of course, in the way you're saying, and as Dante himself would, that to do that is precisely to have a stance of receptivity, because we can't simply, I think Dante would say, do that all on our own. But I suppose I'm wondering whether we can be habituated in those things. Uh, say a word about that if you like, and then I have a final question.
Yeah, I wouldn't say habituated, because that makes it a natural virtue that I'm getting through my kind of attainment. I think we can, by a steady openness, stand ready to receive grace. But there is something anomalous and strange about it, where you could say to a kid, let's say, no, let's really work on this, make you more courageous. And by putting you gradually into, dangerous situations and habituating you to do, the right thing under pressure, et cetera, I can habituate you toward justice by doing just things. But you can't, at least in the Christian take, be habituated to faith, hope, and love. They're given through grace. Now, there can be, as I say, that steady openness of the will toward receiving them, but they come as a gift, not as an achievement.
Yes, well, let's resume that another time, because again, in my reading of Dante, I would say that who I think is relying on Thomas there in terms of the lux gloriae, the light that enables our vision, and the whole logic of the paradiso. It's not simply a passivity. We're coming to actively will. I think Dante would say through grace. Through gift, although there would be gift for him, I think, even in the natural cardinal virtues. The natural light, isn't it? In the comedy, I think it's the way I'll have to get this right, but the way the shadows of moon and the shadow, the light cast. I'm afraid I can't quite get the image right, but that even the natural virtues are undertaken, you might say, in light of the infinite divine economy. All things, you might say, are in light of that, and moved by that, as the words of the last words of the Paradiso are, for example.
You're touching on a very interesting question, because you have in Thomas the natural virtues, but you've also got what he calls the infused virtues, and there's a kind of supernatural prudence, courage, justice, etc. So that's another level of the virtues.
Yes, but say faith, hope, and charity, though, are then not to be understood as the corresponding virtues of the faculties of memory, or being, knowing and willing, essentially, of the faculties of knowledge and love. So it seems to me there's an activity in those. But let's go ahead and reply to that. But I have one last question for you, which maybe is a way of linking where we've been back to where we started, and certainly give you a chance if you want to say something about the activity or habituation. I actually think we may agree on this, but we're talking about the technical language of what you take habituation to mean, and relative to what I do. But I don't think we're agreeing there. But yeah.
No, I certainly hold to cooperation with grace. I mean, there's the classic Catholic thing: you cooperate with grace, but it's not a question of activity in the natural sense, which Aristotle would have articulated. There's something really new on offer. But sure, that's because God's not competitive with us. So the openness to grace is not, as you correctly suggest, not like sheer passivity in sort of a natural way. Like I'm just totally passive to whatever you're doing to me. Because when God acts, it awakens the best in me, and so on. So I certainly agree with that. There's a cooperation with it.
Yes. This would be a conversation I'd love to pursue over a bottle of wine, and we can talk about how Dante and Aquinas take up the Aristotelian ethical standpoint and transform it in light of what they would take to be a much fuller revelation. But let me return to where we started and draw this to a circle. You spoke beautifully about what it means to be sort of fully activated as a human being. And you also spoke about the need for the recovery of the philosophical tradition in order to perceive higher and, in fact, more fundamentally knowable truths, and the corresponding degradation of our humanity without those higher forms of knowing.
Mhm.
What advice do you give to people who say, "Man, I've got to get a better grip on what's really real, and I want to understand what I'm doing. I can't just start, I don't know, I don't believe in, I don't know, the creed or the Christian religion or any other religion, but I know that I want to have a fuller encounter with what's really real in my life. I want to go on that ladder of ascent that they're talking about, the movement upward and inward, or towards truer forms of love and encounter with what's true and beautiful and good." Can you just say a few words of how you advise people to start where you are, to move to higher and truer forms of knowledge and love?
Yeah, I like that question. And it does bring us back to the beginning, which is good too. As I mentioned, Plato offers not so much a doctrine, that's to read him in a very modern sort of way. He offers a set of exercises, it seems to me, to get us out of the cave and to get us to higher points in the line, etc. I've done this with people who are very secularist, very materialist, but let's say they're deeply interested in mathematics. And I'll say, well, let's start looking at mathematical truths that are timeless and spaceless and transcend matter. Even something as simple as a number. What is that number in itself, or a geometrical form? What is that? It's a type of being for sure, and you're finding delight in knowing it, but it can't be placed in time or space. It's not a particular thing. In a way, mathematics has broken you out of the cave. Now, keep going. And then I would maybe draw someone into more philosophical modes of thinking. These give you access to realities that can't be pinned down in that empirical scientific way. I've always loved Thomas Aquinas's word monoduxio, which means a leading by the hand. And he said that philosophy has that function vis-a-vis theology. It's a leading by the hand. Let me take you and show you some things. And I think we can still bring people through a set of spiritual exercises that are designed to awaken their minds and wills, to something beyond their ordinary experience. So I would start with those and show them the great masters, have them read the great masters in these various areas. Let's try to break out of the buffered self, this little narrow, cramped space that ideological scientism has locked us into.
Would you just say one more word? One more word about this. I know that you and I both spent some time with Jordan Peterson, and one thing that I found so moving in Jordan's account of many people who come to him is how they're just desperate for a few crumbs of care and a few gentle words of advice about how to discover the rich meaning that's present in their lives. Love to hear you say a word or two more about the spiritual exercises. I mean, I think there's a sense when Jordan tells people to clean their room, there's something of a kind of taking responsibility for the self that's quite a deep spiritual principle. But you could say a word or two about spiritual exercises, and then maybe in conclusion, you mentioned the great masters. If someone has read almost nothing of the theological, philosophical, literary tradition, or very few things, could you just tell us, in conclusion, a few books that you have really found deeply illuminating yourself?
Yeah. Here's the most fundamental spiritual exercise. Engage in the simplest act of love. Love breaks us out of this narrow ego just by its very nature. Once you grasp the definition of it, well, open yourself to that. Will the good of the other. Do something about it. Now read much of the New Testament under that rubric. Is Jesus inviting people into a stance of love even love of enemies, which is meant to bring us into this altogether new space. I've done that with people pastorally who feel lost, they feel depressed, or they're dry. I'll say every day perform the simplest act of love, and I think you'll find your life changing. In terms of the masters, one that comes to my mind, and as we were talking, and it's a really good place to start because it's a book that's quite short and punchy, is Saint Bonaventure's great book called The Mind's Road to God, the Itinerarium Mentis in Deum. And he has that tripartite move, and you were actually drawing attention to it there. You go out, you go in, and you go up. So you go out to the world, to its intelligibility, to its beauty, to its, truth. And you see a reflection of God. You go in and to your own soul. And we spent the last hour talking about that. It's the longing of the mind and the will, which finally leads you up to this reality, which is reflected in the world and in here, but is not restricted to those realms, but transcends them. So that's a little book. It's maybe 75 pages, but I find that to be very helpful beginning book. Another one I still love for beginners is C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity. I think is a great way to get just sort of oriented to the Christian thing.
Thank you very much for that. And I know that you have no doubt a very busy day, afternoon ahead of you there out there on the West Coast. I'm very grateful for the time you've made for this conversation and for
my pleasure.
The participation that you have, your participation on Thinkspot generally. This is an interesting experiment, which I think is made precisely for these kinds of conversations about things that cannot be approached in a 1 or 2 minute sound bite.
Yeah.
So thank you very, very much for your time. I hope we might speak again, and onward and upward.
I'd love it. Thank you for having me. I really enjoyed it.